Now, the Judicial Service Commission acted unlawfully and went beyond its mandate during the recent interviews for vacancies in the Constitutional Court. At least that's according to court papers filed by the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. CASAC also wants the names of shortlisted candidates, presented to President Cyril Ramaphosa to be set aside. Now, last month, members of the KZN Society of Advocates slammed the poor treatment of judges Daya Pillay and Piet Koen during those JSC interviews. University of Cape Town's Democratic Governance and Rights Unit says the criteria for appointment is actually still unclear, and such a challenge should be welcomed. In fact, we're joined now by senior researcher at that UCT unit, Chris Oxtovy, who joins us via our video link. Chris, a very good morning to you. Great to have you with us on the show this morning. Let me begin by asking for a bit of context from you in terms of this application these court papers that CASAC has filed. Is this the first time that an application of this nature has been filed against the process of appointing judges?
It's not the first challenge to the appointment process.
Mm-hmm.
There was one about 10 years ago where the Cape Bar Council challenged an aspect of the JSC process.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, more recently, the Helen Suzman Foundation also brought a challenge for access to the JSC's record. It is the first time that the court is going to be asked to set aside actual appointments or recommendations for appointments. So it is a very significant challenge in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, take us through, some of the things that CASAC has said in its court papers. Quite strong words there against the process of how these interviews are conducted, and quite alarming to think that even now we don't know exactly what the criteria is for the appointment of these judges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a long-standing issue that, to be honest, a challenge like this has been coming for a while, because the question of criteria has not been as clear as it should be. And so perhaps just to clarify that a little, the Constitution gives quite broad guidance. It requires that judges be fit and proper and be appropriately qualified. And then there's also a provision that requires the demographic transformation of the judiciary in terms of race and gender to be taken into account. But that's as far as the Constitution goes, and so it clearly, the guidance is quite broad. And the argument that many people who've been watching the JSC over the years make is that those criteria need to be fleshed out and need to be substantiated in more detail. And that's just not a process that has happened recently. And the problem with not having greater clarity on those criteria is illustrated in the CASAC challenge, where the point is made that this allows questioning to go in all different directions. Different commissioners may be asking very different things, and it also can lead to unfairness to candidates when there's a lot of variety in different levels of scrutiny that the candidates might be subjected to, and also in the kind of questions that are put to them. And CASAC raised several examples of questions which they argue were not appropriate to be put to candidates. Things like adverse comments against candidates that were put without evidence to substantiate them and without prior warning to the candidates. And the argument is that those sort of inconsistencies and unfairness make the entire process compromised.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I think it's a very strong challenge.
And, the next question, I suppose, is it leads to certain judges facing, shall we say, a tougher grilling than others. The KZN Society of Advocates, for example, singling out Judge Daya Pillay and Judge Piet Koen for the way they were treated compared to the other judges.
Yes. CASAC's challenge focuses a lot on Judge Pillay's interview, and there were obviously very famous questions or infamous questions, perhaps I should say, where she was asked about her relationship to Minister Pravin Gordhan and so forth. And CASAC put some of those questions squarely in issue. Judge Koen was in fact a candidate for the Supreme Court of Appeal, so his interview is in particular subject of the CASAC litigation. But the CASAC challenge also looks at other questions put to Judges David Unterhalter and Faisa Kathri Setlwane, where they also argue that those candidates were unfairly treated. And so the CASAC argument is that because of that unfairness, it renders the entire process and all the recommendations put to the President subject to be set aside.
So these court papers filed by CASAC, depending on the decision made by the court, aside from setting aside those recommendations made to the President, does it also mean what comes out of this process is an actual set of criteria, clearer guidelines in terms of questioning?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, ultimately, that is going to have to be work that the JSC itself will need to do. A court judgment may give some guidance as to what those criteria are, but it won't necessarily provide, everything that people are looking for. That's really something that, if the JSC is unsuccessful, it's going to have to go away and do that work and develop those greater guidelines itself. Mm-hmm. So I think it is crucially important that is what the JSC does and begins to do right away, regardless of the outcome of the court case. Mm. And it's an important item that's going to be in the inbox of the next and incoming Chief Justice, who will, of course, chair the JSC in the future.
Yeah. I mean, as it stands, JSC commissioners who CASAC says failed dismally during these constitutional court interviews, but as it stands, JSC commissioners go in there and they are sort of free to ask whatever question and push whichever judge they happen to have an issue with as far as they'd like.
Well, that's what appears to be the case. I mean, I've watched the JSC over a period of sort of 10 years or more, and that's always seemed the case to me, that there isn't a great deal of standardization and consensus. Of course, the JSC's got to have flexibility to ask, different things when issues are raised by a particular candidate that might not be present for another. Excuse me. But I mean, the problem is, for example, when you see objections being raised to a line of questioning, which does happen sometimes in the JSC, it always appears that, that issue gets decided on the fly in the interviews, that there's not reference back to some sense of shared standardized criteria, which just illustrates the problem that the CASAC challenge raises. And I think the fact that the Commission is very diverse, which in a way can be a strength, but it also means that there are lots of different perspectives and different interests coming into the process, and that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage to the JSC. Mm.
Especially if those different interests are also political, let's say.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, I think people looking at the JSC often see the large number of politicians on it and see that as a major problem, and I think in some cases it is. But I think one should also be careful of falling into the trap of thinking that all the problems on the Commission are stemming from the politicians only, because I've certainly observed many problematic questions over the years coming also from lawyers and judges on the Commission. So I think its work on the criteria is something that all members of the Commission need to do.
Yeah. I mean, overall, it's a good thing that we are seeing this challenge. The one question I did want to ask you is whether this challenge by CASAC, whether it includes perhaps actual complaints from the judges themselves. You told us earlier that Judge Daya Pillay features quite strongly in that challenge by CASAC, but are they actually part in some way of the challenge?
No, well, only in the sense that they are formally cited as parties, as they are, they're involved. I'm not aware that it doesn't appear from the papers that any of the judges are directly involved in the sense of bringing the challenge themselves. I think the CASAC papers have particularly highlighted certain interviews because they provided the most striking examples of the issues that CASAC are raising. So I wouldn't expect the judges themselves to be directly involved in the litigation in any way. But obviously they may well be impacted by the outcome if the challenge is successful, and this round of interviews would presumably then have to be run again. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of timings now, the court papers have been filed. What happens from then on? What's the process, if you can explain it to us, Chris?
Well, so basically the case will have to be set down and heard. CASAC have asked in the papers for an expedited date of the hearing. I'm not offhand sure exactly how long that's going to be, but it's not going to be next week. Let's put it that way. I mean, we're probably looking at a month or so down the line. And then, of course, there's the question of what will happen if an unsuccessful party appeals the case. And I would anticipate that if the case does run, then we're looking at least at an appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal by the unsuccessful side, and perhaps all the way to the Constitutional Court. Yeah. And if that is the case, then we're looking at it running well into next year. So it's not going to be a quick outcome.
Chris Oxtovy, thanks so much for your time this morning, giving us that context to an incredibly important story. He's senior researcher at the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the University of Cape Town. Thanks indeed.